I stood in the dark corner of the penthouse while the man who had stolen my company was selling my code for $100 million. My badge said technical support. Mark accepted the admiring looks of investors near the central holographic stand. He spoke like the creator of the future, even though I had written every key line of the system. Alina stood beside him as chief director. Once, she had admired my ideas. Now she smiled at the man who had erased my name from the patents. They had taken the company through debts that Mark himself had created 6 months earlier. They left me in the hall as service staff so I would silently watch my own triumph. Mark smiled at the investors and launched the first phase of the presentation. Holographic charts shot upward, showing the incredible transaction processing speed of the new financial system. He spoke beautifully, using my own wording from the drafts I had written during sleepless nights. Every word he said was stolen. Every concept belonged to my mind. One of the old investors narrowed his eyes, carefully studying the network architecture. He asked about gateway security, and Mark casually brushed it off, calling it a problem that had been solved long ago. In the closed guest list, I noticed a small mark. Apex. Victor Rain had not come in person, but his people were already looking at my stolen code. I looked at the screen of my work tablet. Inside the source code Mark was so proudly demonstrating, a small script trap was sleeping, invisible to everyone else's eyes. The investor asked to see real-time load distribution. He needed proof that the platform could handle peak user inflow without the servers collapsing. Mark nodded to Alina, and she obediently approached the terminal. Her fingers moved quickly across the touch panel, entering access passwords. I knew those passwords by heart because originally they had been mine. She entered the administrator master key, the same key they had stolen from my local drive 3 weeks earlier, thinking I would not notice the traces of the breach in the system log. The system responded with a pleasant green glow, confirming highest level access rights. The investors nodded approvingly when they saw the flawless smoothness of the interface. Mark smiled in triumph. None of them guessed that the green glow was only decoration. The true core of the system was still under my full control through the immutable patent records of the fund. The lead investor folded his arms. He said beautiful presentations no longer impressed him and demanded an immediate stress test under maximum financial load. Mark's smile twitched, but only for a fraction of a second. He could not refuse, or the $100 million deal would collapse right there, among the glass walls of that luxury loft. Alina nervously adjusted the edge of her designer jacket. She knew perfectly well that the system had never passed tests at that level without my direct involvement in traffic distribution. She threw me a quick, anxious glance. In her eyes, there was a silent request to be ready if something went wrong. I answered her with a cold, empty stare. Mark gave the signal, and Alina launched the artificial traffic generation script. Millions of virtual requests crashed into the platform servers, imitating a global launch of the project. The holographic bars trembled, changing color from green to yellow. The room filled with the quiet hum of cooling systems. The investors leaned forward like predators sensing blood. I watched everything through my closed monitor. Protection protocols began building barriers, trying to handle the colossal data volume. The code worked exactly the way I had written it. For a moment, the monitor showed an outside access scanner. If it had reached the root node before stabilization, the trap would have opened right in front of the investors. Suddenly, a synchronization error warning flashed on the main screen. One of the data clusters began to lag, threatening to collapse the entire transaction chain. The room fell into dead silence. Mark tensed. His confident posture vanished, replaced by frantic attempts to understand the problem. He had never understood the deep architecture, preferring only to enjoy the results. Alina began entering corrective commands quickly. Her hands trembled over the keyboard. She tried to redistribute computing power, but the system stubbornly denied her access. The investor frowned and asked what was happening to the liquidity flow. Mark forced out a nervous laugh and called it standard algorithm calibration before full capacity. I saw large drops of sweat appear on Mark's forehead. He turned toward me and made a barely noticeable hand gesture. It was an order to intervene immediately and save his perfect presentation from total collapse. I did not move. My hands remained calmly resting on the table. I had no intention of fixing the mistake they had caused with their own greed and complete technical ignorance. The critical load level reached 99%. If the stress test failed, they would lose not only the investment, but also their reputation across the entire global technology market. At the final second, when the red error bar was ready to swallow the entire screen, the system suddenly stabilized, the charts leveled out, and the warning windows smoothly dissolved. Mark exhaled loudly and instantly pulled the mask of a winner back onto his face. He spread his arms proudly and told the investors that the platform's built-in artificial intelligence had successfully suppressed the anomaly. The investors began applauding with approval. They believed the performance, they believed in Mark's genius. The deal was saved, and the atmosphere in the glass penthouse became relaxed again. But I knew the truth. The system had not fixed the error by itself. My hidden financial module, buried deep in the core, had activated and absorbed the excess load, taking part of their administrative rights. With every overload like this, the code quietly drained the company's system liquidity. Mark thought he had won, but in reality, he had just started the timer of his own destruction. After the official part ended, the guests moved into the spacious lounge area, where waiters were already pouring expensive wine. Mark accepted congratulations, shaking hands with the richest people in the city. Alina stepped away from the noisy crowd and walked toward me. Her face was still burning from the stress she had just endured. She stopped in front of my desk, crossing her arms in her usual defensive gesture. She quietly hissed that I could have shown more initiative. According to her, we were all working toward one common cause, and my sabotage could have cost the company a grand future. Her voice trembled with hidden anger. I looked at her silently. This woman had once sworn loyalty to me, then helped Mark forge documents transferring my intellectual property. Now she dared to speak about duty. I answered that I was merely performing my new role as a technical support specialist, and support does not interfere with the work of a genius founder until he publicly asks for help. Alina pressed her lips together, clearly irritated by my absolute calm. She began saying that I should forget old grievances, that Mark had given me a chance to remain in the project, and I should be grateful. She assured me that after the investment contract was signed, my salary would be significantly increased. She was trying to buy my loyalty with crumbs from the very table I had built with my own hands. I gently advised her to watch the system logs more carefully. My tone was even, without a single drop of threat, but for some reason Alina nervously stepped back a full step. She did not understand the true meaning of my words, dismissing them as the wounded pride of a defeated loser. With a contemptuous snort, Alina turned around and returned to the shining Mark. Mark gave a pompous toast about overcoming difficulties and the birth of a new technological empire. The investors laughed, anticipating huge profits from a future monopoly in the decentralized finance market. I opened a background process on my tablet. Lines of a log file ran from top to bottom, recording every second of the stress test that had just passed. To an ordinary eye, it was just an endless stream of numbers, but I saw a new hash appear in the 6th line of the system registry. A transaction no one had noticed. My hidden script had taken the first 0.1% from the total pool of starting liquidity. Those funds did not go to a random account. They were locked inside an automatic contract controlled only by an investment fund named Kuro, my personal shadow fund. Mark continued smiling at the investors, unaware that the foundation of his glass empire had just received its first microscopic crack, and that crack would inevitably grow with every new financial operation. The lead investor approached the central table and took out a stylus. He was ready to sign the preliminary memorandum of intent. This document would give Mark access to the first tranche of funding. Alina stood beside him, holding her breath. This was her moment of triumph, the moment she had betrayed me for, choosing status and money instead of conscience. She looked at the stylus as if it were a magic wand. The electronic signature landed on the investor's tablet. The deal was officially registered in the preliminary registry. Mark happily embraced the investor, feeling like the rightful ruler of the high-tech world. At that moment, a pop-up window appeared on my screen. A notification from the closed network confirmed the creation of a new block. The system had permanently recorded the fact that Mark had used stolen code. The immutable patent records of my fund were immutable. Now that outside investors had officially injected capital into this product, they had automatically become involved in the use of an unlicensed core. Mark turned and looked in my direction. His gaze held open superiority. He was sure he had finally broken me, turning me into an obedient slave of his growing corporation. He walked over to me, holding a half-empty glass in his hand. He smelled of expensive cologne and strong alcohol. He leaned over my desk, resting one hand on the edge of the touch panel, and gave me a crooked smirk. He quietly said I had done well in the role of furniture. According to him, I needed to get used to the shadows, because from now on, that was the only place where I belonged. He enjoyed his power, drunk on my imaginary weakness. I nodded without taking my eyes off the monitor. I told him that the shadows were the best place to watch load-bearing structures collapse. Mark frowned, failing to catch the hidden meaning of my words. He decided it was just a pathetic attempt to save face. With a smirk, he patted me on the shoulder the way an arrogant owner pats an obedient dog. Then he turned and walked back to his new partners. I wiped the mark of his hand from the touch panel. The recorder safely built into my smart bracelet had just saved his mocking words. One more tiny piece of evidence in the huge folder of his future crimes. The presentation slowly came to an end. Investors began gathering near the exit, exchanging excited comments about the platform's brilliant prospects. They spoke animatedly about the coming domination of the startup market. Alina escorted guests to the elevator, giving each one a dazzling smile. She looked like the mistress of the situation. Her confidence stood on a solid foundation of lies that seemed unshakable to her. When the elevator doors closed behind the last departing guest, Mark dropped heavily into a leather chair. He loosened his tie and laughed loudly, celebrating his final victory over all envious people and doubters. He shouted to Alina that now they could finally buy the huge country house she had always dreamed of. Other people's money was already clouding their minds, making them believe in their own uniqueness. I continued methodically packing my equipment into a black technical case. Every movement I made was precise and calm. I felt no blind hatred toward them, only cold anticipation of the exact finale. Before closing the laptop, I launched the final hidden synchronization command. The protocol of the _quote_2__fund quietly integrated itself into the updated architecture of the platform. The liquidity extraction mechanism was ready. A green line blinked on the screen. An anonymous account accepted the first microtransaction and converted it into a digital equivalent. It was only a few miserable pennies compared to billion-scale turnover, but it was only the beginning. Mark casually called out to me, ordering me to prepare a detailed report on server stability by tomorrow morning. He spoke to me like service staff, forgetting who had written every line of his code. I looked him straight in the eyes and calmly said the report would be perfect. So perfect that no strict auditor would find a flaw in it until it was already too late. Mark was too drunk on success to listen to my tone and lazily waved me off. But Alina froze for a moment, as if she had felt an icy draft inside the perfectly heated luxury penthouse. She stared at my closed technical case but never dared to ask a question. Fear of losing her new world made her stubbornly close her eyes to every warning sign. I confidently headed toward the exit, leaving them in the center of the sparkling empty hall. They truly believed they had stolen my life and built their invincible empire on its ruins. But they did not understand the main rule of complex systems. Whoever owns the hidden root access always controls the final result. No matter whose name stands on the public facade, they signed a contract for $100 million without even suspecting that all that money already technically belonged to the _quote_3__fund. The trap they had mistaken for their triumph finally snapped shut. The high-speed elevator doors closed smoothly, cutting me off from the sounds of their stolen celebration. In my pocket, my tablet vibrated, receiving encrypted reports about every new transaction passing through Mark's system. Tomorrow, they would begin spending the investment money mindlessly, expanding server capacity, and my financial module would take exactly enough to make the system appear unprofitable. They would lead the company to bankruptcy themselves, step by step destroying their false status. When they hit bottom, I would be waiting with their own contracts. The game had begun. Part 2. The morning after the presentation began with a public demonstration of new power. Mark rented the top 2 floors of the most expensive business center in the capital, wanting to secure his status. He was no longer an ambitious startup founder from a cramped office. Now, every step he took and every order he gave had to loudly announce his incredible financial triumph. The first tranche of that $100 million was already sitting in the corporate account. Those huge figures pleasantly warmed his inflated ego, making him forget all caution. The glass walls of the new office reflected the bright morning sunlight. They created the perfect illusion of absolute transparency and flawless purity in their innovative business. I stood in the corner of the spacious server room, configuring basic routers. From my shadow, I silently and carefully watched this luxurious but fake performance. Mark loudly gave orders to interior designers. He chose expensive Italian chairs, not caring about the real security of the platform's software core. His highest priority was the urgent purchase of powerful server equipment. He wanted to impress investors with blinking indicators inside transparent racks. The protected communicator in my pocket vibrated twice. That short signal meant the start of the hidden automatic work of my financial module. As soon as Mark proudly paid for the first batch of servers worth $3 million, my hidden algorithm instantly woke up and bit off its first legal share of liquidity. Exactly 10% of every transaction amount instantly dissolved into complex protected payment routes. Those funds quietly went to the secured accounts of the quote_4__fund. Mark's system was configured to record those financial losses as standard processing fees for high-load international transfers. No red flags. He was too busy choosing the leather shade for the sofas in the lounge area to check the boring, monotonous lines of system financial logs in the administrative panel. My technological trap worked flawlessly. It turned every showy expense of his into a steady stream of hidden liquidity for my own future empire. Closer to noon, Alina entered the cool server room. She tightly held a smooth leather folder with gold embossing of the newly approved corporate logo. Her confident steps were light and graceful. She moved as if she had spent her entire conscious life managing multi-billion-dollar technology conglomerates. Her new suit fit flawlessly, emphasizing the status of a woman who had conquered the top of the industry. She stopped several meters away from me, maintaining clear social distance. She looked carefully at the floor, trying hard not to stain the hem of her expensive dress on the technical cables snaking around my workstation. Alina slowly handed me a thick sheet of paper. On the snow-white surface in tiny, barely readable font was an updated corporate non-disclosure agreement. I ran my eyes over the text and gave a barely noticeable smirk. She was offering me an official senior engineer position with a fixed salary of a pathetic $5,000. In exchange for that openly ridiculous handout, I was supposed to forever give up any claims and copyrights to the platform source code, transferring them personally to Mark. Alina spoke first with caution. She actively tried to give her voice the soft, patronizing tones of an understanding and wise top manager. According to her beautiful words, Mark was generously ready to forget my old grievances. All that was required of me was to show proper loyalty and simply sign this important document. I carefully looked at her face, trying to find even a faint shadow of sincere remorse for the stolen project, ruined trust, and trampled years of joint work. But her cold eyes showed only slight irritation because I was studying the proposed legal wording for too long and too carefully. She was in a hurry to return to her new office. I took the metal pen and signed at the very bottom of the page without the slightest hesitation. I agreed to all the enslaving terms without asking a single unnecessary question. Alina exhaled in relief and quickly hid the document inside her prestigious folder. She naively decided she had finally and permanently bought my complete silence for those pennies. She did not even suspect that the pompous contract was void. I had used my old digital signature, which no longer had legal force in the new registries. Her desire to protect her new social status made her commit a critical legal mistake. She herself handed me the perfect weapon for a future court tribunal. In the second half of the workday, the euphoria from moving into the new office suddenly gave way to the first wave of growing corporate panic. The perfect facade developed a tiny crack. Mark stormed aggressively into the technical department, waving an investor's tablet. On the bright screen of his device, red financial metric charts glowed with alarm. The new servers had been successfully launched an hour earlier. Real user traffic was growing exponentially, but the company's overall financial balance was somehow falling rapidly. The system impartially recorded colossal losses on every completed transaction. It looked as if the investment money was simply disappearing into a huge invisible black hole. Mark nervously paced between the racks, blaming cloud service providers for everything. He decided they had secretly raised rates right after the loud investment round. His ego did not allow him to even consider that the problem lay in the architecture of the code itself. It was easier to find an external enemy than to admit his own incompetence. He categorically demanded that I immediately write a patch hiding those loss indicators. Mark was terrified that investors would see the real numbers in the monitoring panel. I calmly nodded, agreeing to carry out his strict order. Slowly sitting down at the desk, I began entering complex system commands on my isolated engineering console. Mark stood directly behind my back, breathing heavily and cursing greedy contractors. He sincerely believed the whole world was trying to profit from his unique talent and technological genius. My fingers flew quickly across the keyboard, creating a beautiful and believable visual shell for the main financial dashboard. I was sewing a luxurious suit for the rotting corpse of the platform. I quickly wrote a small script that intercepted data before it appeared on the screen. It neatly replaced the real red loss numbers with generated green profit values. As soon as I pressed the enter key, the falling chart on Mark's tablet instantly shot upward. The screen turned soothing green, showing unbelievable record margins. Mark gave a victorious smirk, deciding the problem had been successfully solved. He arrogantly ordered me never again to allow such irritating visual bugs in his perfect system. He left the server room with undisguised pride, rushing to show the updated charts to the investors. Mark planned to convince them of the absolute reliability and profitability of his product. I watched him go with a calm gaze, fully understanding the true state of affairs. His beautiful fake statistics did nothing to cancel the real and inevitable financial collapse of the company. My hidden financial module continued its quiet and visible work. It mercilessly drained hundreds of thousands of dollars from every newly connected server node. By forcing me to hide the real losses, Mark personally created irrefutable digital evidence of deliberate deception of qualified investors. The trap tightened further. That same evening, large-scale filming began in the central hall of the office. A well-known business television channel arrived to record a major exclusive report about rising stars of the industry. Alina stood in front of bright studio cameras, wearing a strict designer suit. She radiated absolute confidence, superiority, and the cold shine of newly acquired elite status. An experienced journalist asked her difficult questions about the history of their breakthrough technology. Alina answered with striking theatrical ease and rehearsed inspiration. One question concerned rumors about interest from the Apex Corporation. Alina smiled too quickly and said that strong players always watch future leaders. She spoke with pleasure about how she and Mark had spent long nights working on the code architecture. She colorfully described how they overcame countless technical difficulties together. There was not the slightest doubt or hesitation in her smooth speech. She had completely merged with her new image as a successful technology visionary and brilliant strategist. Without shame, Alina claimed my sleepless nights, the most complex algorithms, and the very genius solutions I had created alone in our old laboratory. She had believed so deeply in that convenient invented reality that she sincerely considered herself a full co-author of the platform. The boundary of truth had been erased under the pressure of her ambition. I stood in the deep shadow behind the massive lighting equipment, holding an active recorder in my pocket. I coldly recorded every public lie of hers for the future trial. She looked straight into the television camera lens as if challenging the whole world. That look was supposed to confirm her undisputed power over the situation and over other people's fates. Her boundless pride became the perfect mechanism of self-destruction. Every confident word she said turned into a thick concrete wall, cutting off every possible retreat. In the coming court proceedings, this pompous interview would become the main trump card. It would prove her direct, conscious, and voluntary participation in a large-scale fraud. She had just publicly confirmed that she understood the system architecture perfectly. With that statement, she permanently deprived herself of the chance to claim simple ignorance or mistake. When Mark approached her for a beautiful joint cover photo, they were glowing. Camera flashes captured the perfect couple of young rulers of the new digital world. But from my shadow, I saw only two blind hostages of their own greed. They happily posed for photographers while standing directly on the lid of a bomb whose timer had already been activated. Closer to midnight, the luxurious office finally emptied. I remained alone in the humming silence of the server room, lit only by the cold neon glow of system monitors. It was time to make the next critical move in my long strategic game. It was a move Mark and Alina could not have even imagined in their best dreams. I opened the protected encrypted terminal of the Kuro Fund. The system required biometric confirmation before displaying the current report on accumulated hidden liquidity. The numbers were pleasing to the eye. The amount in my fund's anonymous accounts had already significantly exceeded the value of all the infrastructure Mark had rented with such ridiculous pomp that morning. I entered several long command lines, initiating the complex process of buying corporate debt obligations. The operation was carried out through a chain of trusted shell companies. My __quote_6__fund officially and legally bought the company, providing Mark with server leasing services. With a single keystroke, I became its sole and rightful owner. The entire process took no more than 10 minutes. All necessary legal documents were automatically generated and instantly signed with immutable digital keys in the immutable registry. Now, every humming server, every fiber optic cable, and every glass rack in that pompous office technically and legally belonged to my secret investment fund. Mark was sleeping in his luxury apartment, certain of his own invulnerability. He thought he controlled the physical infrastructure of the project thanks to investor money, but the brutal reality was that he had just signed a harsh debt contract without looking, and he had signed it with the man he considered his obedient system administrator. The contract contained one small but important clause. If Mark's company missed even one monthly payment for equipment rental, I had the full legal right to shut down the entire system. And considering that my hidden financial module continued methodically draining liquidity with every transaction, that payment default was no longer a probability, but only an inevitable matter of time. After confirming the successful completion of the operation, I closed the terminal. I carefully and pedantically erased all traces of my presence from the routing system, then turned off the light in the server room. Through the panoramic glass walls, the sleeping night city was perfectly visible. It glittered with thousands of lights, reminding me of a huge motherboard with millions of shimmering bright micro-contacts. Tomorrow morning, Mark would return to this office and continue mindlessly spending other people's millions. He would walk importantly through the corridors, sincerely thinking he was building his unassailable technological empire. But the foundation of his shining glass empire no longer belonged to him. He was already faithfully paying a huge tribute to the very ghost he had arrogantly tried to erase from the history of the platform's creation. Part 3. The morning in the new glass office began with Mark's loud laughter. He strolled lazily between the glowing server racks, sincerely considering himself their full owner. Alina followed close behind him, holding a tablet with presentations. She listened with delight to Mark's speeches about the coming global expansion, forgetting her fears. I sat silently at the far desk, pretending to be absorbed in configuring the cooling system. On my hidden monitor, lines of code ran, confirming the work of the financial module. Every financial transaction inside their praised platform neatly pinched off exactly 10%. Those sums were instantly converted and sent to my fund's accounts. Mark approached my desk and casually threw a stack of printed business cards onto it. His name shone in gold embossing on the thick cardstock, with the proud title of Chief Executive Officer. He ordered me to prepare the servers for integration of the new advertising module immediately. The investors wanted a beautiful picture, and Mark desperately wanted to throw dust in their eyes. I calmly nodded, agreeing to carry out his next absurd demand. He did not even suspect that every new process of his only accelerated the mechanism draining money. Alina came closer and condescendingly patted me on the shoulder. She advised me to work harder so I could earn a small bonus from the investment pool at the end of the quarter. Her words sounded so sincere, as if she truly believed in her leadership role. The illusion of power over another person's intellect had already distorted her perception of reality. I thanked her for her concern, holding back a cold smile. My investment fund already owned all this equipment, while they continued playing great bosses on my personal stage. Closer to noon, an alarming yellow warning suddenly flashed on the central control screen. The system detected an unexpected liquidity drop in the reserve pool. Mark instantly went pale when he saw the flashing numbers on the main panel. He nervously looked around, checking whether any representatives of the fund were in the office at that moment. He called me over with a sharp gesture, demanding an immediate explanation for the drop in indicators. His voice trembled with carefully hidden panic because he did not understand the system. I calmly opened the technical log and began tracing my finger along long lines of code. In a monotonous voice, I explained that these were temporary costs for synchronizing the new servers. Of course, it was an absolute lie. The missing funds were already resting peacefully in the encrypted accounts of the Kuro Fund, waiting for their moment to deliver a crushing blow. Mark cursed through his teeth and ordered me to hide the deficit from the eyes of inspectors. He directly demanded that I change the balance display formula so the numbers would always stay green. I deliberately asked again whether he was certain such direct interference in reporting was necessary. I reminded him of the strict financial control rules imposed by the investors. My show of resistance enraged him even more. He raised his voice and declared that he was the sole owner of the project. and I was obligated to obey his orders without question. Alina supported him fearfully, asking me not to create unnecessary problems out of nowhere. She assured me that we would put everything back in place as soon as we attracted new clients. I shrugged and entered the balance masking command right in front of their eyes. At the same moment, the hidden recorder in my smart bracelet saved the full recording of that criminal order. Mark exhaled with relief when the charts on the screen began climbing again, filling with false optimism. He naively believed digital makeup could save the foundation. He still did not know that falsifying financial reports before a venture fund was a serious crime, and he had just personally tightened the noose around his own neck. After lunch, the glass doors of the office slid open, admitting an unexpected guest. The investors had sent their chief technical auditor for a scheduled architecture review. Her name was Kira. She was a young woman in a strict suit with a sharp and cold gaze. Unlike the naive financiers, she understood technology perfectly. Mark instantly put on his most charming smile and rushed to meet the inspector. He began showering her with fashionable terms, trying to create the illusion of full control. Alina joined the performance as well, proudly introducing herself as the chief architect of the entire platform. She repeated memorized phrases from my old notebook, hoping to impress her. But Kira did not even look at the beautiful charts Mark proudly displayed on the screen. She asked for direct access to the raw router data. Mark's smile froze for a moment, and a genuine animal fear flashed in Alina's eyes. They both understood perfectly that raw logs did not obey their fake code. Mark tried to laugh it off, saying the developer interface was currently being updated. He offered Kira expensive coffee and a pretty presentation. The auditor coldly refused the drink and repeated her demand in a hard tone that allowed no objections. The investors were not going to risk $100 million without control. Mark had no choice but to call me. He casually snapped his fingers, ordering his obedient system administrator to open the necessary access for the guest. I approached the terminal and quickly entered a long password. Kira carefully watched every movement of my fingers, noting my incredible speed and muscle memory. She leaned toward the monitor, ignoring Mark's attempts to continue small talk. Her eyes moved quickly across the lines of code, searching for inconsistencies in the registry logic. Suddenly, she stopped and pointed her pen at a complex fragment of memory allocation. She asked Alina a direct technical question about why that specific encryption method had been chosen. A heavy, almost ringing silence hung in the spacious office. Alina opened her mouth but could not force out a single coherent word, because she had never understood cryptography. Red patches appeared on her face and her hands nervously clutched the edge of the table. She looked pleadingly at Mark, expecting him to somehow save her from public disgrace. Mark tried to intervene, beginning to spout obvious nonsense about innovative approaches and unconventional thinking. But Kira cut him off mid-sentence, demanding an answer only from the architect. Realizing the situation was slipping out of control, Mark irritably nodded toward me. He said that such minor technical details were usually assigned to ordinary staff. I held the pause just long enough for Alina's humiliation to remain permanently fixed in the auditor's memory. Then, in an even voice, I gave a flawless explanation of the algorithm's logic. I spoke calmly and confidently, as if giving a lecture to careless students. I explained how asymmetric encryption protects nodes from overload during mass user requests. Kira gave me a long, studying look. In her eyes flashed clear surprise mixed with sudden understanding of the true balance of power in that glass room. She was too smart to believe the fairy tale about genius founders and an overly educated administrator. She clearly saw who the real brain of the system was. Alina swallowed nervously, trying to recover the pathetic remnants of her authority. She hurriedly added that I had simply voiced her original idea, which she had described in detail in the task.
A lie always requires constant maintenance. Alina is trying to steal not only status, but reality itself, sincerely believing that another person's intelligence can simply be claimed by right of position. It is the classic trap of incompetence. When an imposter faces a real professional, their ego prefers to cling to absurd illusions, rather than acknowledge its absolute emptiness.
Kira said nothing in response to Alina's excuses. She simply made a brief note in her electronic notebook, and that quiet sound seemed to me like the most beautiful chord of the day. She continued the review, deliberately directing technical questions to me now. Each answer I gave was flawless, but I still left the auditor room to think. I deliberately did not hide one strange route in the logs, leading to an empty reserve node. It was a tiny breadcrumb I had carefully left for the investors. Kira noticed the oddity and frowned. She asked why part of the outgoing traffic was being directed to a hidden address not listed in the official project documentation. At that moment, the risk became real. If Kira went deeper, she would see the Kuro fund before Mark had time to claim that route as his own. Mark tensed like a stretched wire. He had no idea what the hidden routes were, but his survival instinct told him that the question carried deadly danger. I calmly answered that it was a standard backup protocol approved by management. At the same time, I looked meaningfully at Mark, forcing him to confirm the lie. Mark hurriedly nodded, happily declaring that it was his personal initiative to improve security. Once again, he took responsibility for a process that led him straight into the abyss. After finishing the review, Kira gave a dry farewell and left the office. Her steps echoed heavily from the glass walls, leaving behind the oppressive atmosphere of an approaching catastrophe. As soon as the doors closed, Mark slammed his fist onto the table in rage. He attacked Alina, accusing her of looking like a complete idiot in front of a representative of a major fund. Alina shouted back that I had deliberately set her up by choosing overly complex terms. Her face twisted with anger, and the illusion of their perfect partnership developed a crack. My tablet on the desk vibrated briefly, drawing attention. A system notification from the bank serving my fund's shell company appeared on the screen. It was time for the first durability test. The automatic contract initiated a withdrawal from Mark's account as the monthly rent for all the equipment. The amount was quite large, but under normal conditions, perfectly manageable for a startup. However, because of the constant work of my financial module, there was no longer enough free operating liquidity. A red transaction error window flashed on the central terminal. The system dryly stated that the operating account did not have enough funds for the mandatory payment. Mark abruptly stopped shouting and stared at the screen with whitened eyes. He could not believe their praised budget had begun melting at such a frightening speed after only a few days of work. He rushed to the keyboard and frantically checked the bank statements. The numbers were merciless. The legal account was almost empty, and the rental payment deadline would expire in 1 hour. The contract stated in black and white that any payment delay gave the lessor the right to shut down the servers immediately. A system shutdown meant instant death for the project. Alina approached him, nervously twisting the sleeve of her expensive blouse. She asked why the system was showing a payment error for the very servers they had so proudly rented the day before. Mark roughly pushed her hand away and ordered her to shut up. His mind feverishly searched for a way out of a situation that threatened to destroy his reputation as a successful businessman right now. He had only one way out, and I knew exactly which path his nature would choose. The investor's transit account held huge funds meant strictly for marketing. Using those designated funds to cover current debts was a gross violation of the contract. It was a direct path to a real prison sentence for misusing investment money. But fear of immediate server shutdown proved stronger than common sense. With trembling hands, Mark opened the transit account control panel and began entering a transfer command. He ordered me to remove the lock from the transit pool immediately. He said it was a temporary measure and that he would return the money once he figured out the strange financial drops. I looked him straight in the eyes and slowly repeated his order aloud one more time. I wanted to make sure the recorder on my wrist captured every word of his confession to financial manipulation. He screamed hysterically, demanding that I obey without unnecessary questions. His face shone with sweat, and his former relaxed confidence dissolved into sticky fear of losing status. I obediently entered the unlock code and confirmed the operation. The transit investment money tore itself from its protected place and went straight to the accounts of my hidden fund. A green check mark on the screen confirmed successful payment of the server lease. Mark collapsed weakly into a chair, wiping his forehead. He thought he had just saved his company from collapse, but reality was different. He had just voluntarily transferred investors' designated money into the hands of the man he had betrayed, becoming a real financial criminal in the process. Alina looked anxiously at the slumped Mark. She was beginning to dimly realize that the glass castle had been built on quicksand, but she was still afraid to admit her mistake to herself. I carefully copied the illegal transfer logs to a protected external drive. That irrefutable evidence would become the final chord in the destruction of their pathetic empire. At that moment, a new message from Kira arrived on the work terminal. The auditor dryly informed us that tomorrow morning she would conduct a strict, unscheduled inspection of all transit accounts in the project. Mark's face twisted with genuine horror. He had just emptied the very account that would be audited tomorrow. The trap had snapped shut so tightly that the bones had begun to crack. Part 4. The morning began with deafening silence in the luxury penthouse. Panoramic windows let in cold light, illuminating the beautiful facade of the glass empire Mark considered his impregnable fortress. In 1 hour, Kira was supposed to arrive with her financial inspection. Mark nervously paced the spacious corridor, trying to convince himself that yesterday's illegal transaction would remain unnoticed. He ordered me to launch the visual data masking algorithm. Soothing green numbers appeared on the central control screen, falsely demonstrating absolute stability in the transit accounts. Alina sat in a deep leather chair, nervously turning the bracelet on her wrist. She desperately clung to the illusion of control, convincing herself that Mark's genius could outsmart any meticulous auditor. I silently configured the display system, following every instruction of my nominal boss. My face remained calm while the internal scripts of the fund prepared to reveal the real picture of what was happening. Mark approached me and arrogantly snapped that I should stand in the shadows and stay out of the way during the inspection. He still sincerely believed technical staff existed only to serve his grand plans. His voice carried the artificial cheer of a man standing blindfolded at the edge of a cliff. He adjusted his expensive Italian tie as if that wardrobe detail could protect him from prison. Alina approached him and tried to smile uncertainly. She quietly asked whether the numbers on the screen would really fool a strict inspection. She desperately wanted to hear another saving lie from his mouth. Mark irritably waved her off, saying investors understood nothing about complex code architecture. He was certain he could talk his way around any specialist with beautiful presentations. I stood by the panoramic window and discreetly activated the hidden recording on my smart bracelet. Every word of theirs, soaked in arrogance and fear, landed in my collection of irrefutable digital evidence. The notification system gave a short signal. The high-speed elevator doors slid open silently, letting Kira into the office. The technical auditor looked perfectly composed and deadly dangerous for them. She held only a thin work tablet in her hands, but to Mark it was more threatening than any weapon. Kira's gaze instantly scanned the room, identifying the balance of power without error. Mark immediately spread into his standard friendly smile, as if a gracious host were welcoming a long-awaited guest. With a broad gesture, he invited her to the central monitor, showing fabricated green charts. Alina hurried to offer Kira coffee, trying to smooth the tension with soft tones, but the auditor did not even glance at the luxurious lounge area. Her penetrating gaze was fixed only on the terminal. Kira coldly said that beautiful public presentations did not interest her. She took a personal drive from her pocket and demanded immediate direct access to the core of the server database. Mark's smile twitched, but he quickly controlled himself, trying to joke about corporate security. He said the system was too complex for direct interference, and offered to export pretty reports. I watched that pathetic attempt to save face from the far corner of the office. Yesterday's ruler of the digital empire now looked like a naughty schoolboy hiding a diary full of bad grades. Kira ignored his pitiful excuses. She moved close to the main console and stated in an unquestionable tone that refusal of access would be treated as a direct violation of the $100 million investment agreement. At the mention of the contract amount, Mark instantly deflated. He reluctantly nodded to me, allowing me to unlock the port. His hands trembled slightly as he stepped away from the terminal, making room for a real professional. The auditor connected her drive to the reserve port. She entered a series of complex command lines with incredible speed, ignoring the fake visual interface of the beautiful user layer. The painted green stability bars instantly disappeared from the huge screen. Instead, endless dry lines of system code began running across it, mercilessly exposing the true underside of the platform's work. Kira launched a deep scanning protocol of fund movement through the transit investment pool. That script had been designed specifically to search for hidden liquidity leaks in complex, tangled networks. Alina instinctively took a step back, feeling the foundation of their invented success collapsing. She did not understand the code lines, but the auditor's tense posture spoke louder than any technical terms. The scanning process took only 40 long seconds. A pulsing red error appeared on the monitor, pointing to a critical balance discrepancy. The designated funds had disappeared without a trace into the unknown. Kira slowly turned toward Mark, her face expressing absolute icy contempt. She calmly stated the fact of a blatant contract violation and demanded an explanation for the disappearance of millions of dollars from the account. It was as if the air had been instantly pumped out of the room. Mark went pale, his breathing broke, and his eyes darted feverishly around the room in search of a saving excuse before the face of irrefutable facts. He tried to say something vague about a hidden system failure and random routing errors. His voice trembled, exposing the panic of a man caught red-handed at the scene of the crime. I stepped forward and confirmed in a neutral tone that the architecture was working perfectly. No routing failures had been recorded. Every transaction left an immutable trail in the immutable registry. Mark shot me a burning look full of helpless rage. He tried to order me to be silent, but in the presence of a strict technical auditor, his fake authority no longer carried any weight. Kira requested a detailed breakdown of the last major financial operation. The screen obediently displayed the recipient account number and the exact transfer time, which matched the moment of Mark's panic yesterday down to the second. The recipient was an outside leasing company secretly controlled by my hidden fund. The purpose of payment stated repayment of server rental debt. Investor money had brazenly gone to cover debts. Alina covered her mouth in horror, finally realizing the scale of the disaster. Using investor marketing funds to pay rent was not just a mistake, it was direct theft of someone else's assets. In desperation, Mark tried to blame me, loudly claiming that I had transferred the money on my own. He accused the system administrator of hacking security protocols and stealing allocated investment capital. His shameless lie was predictable down to the smallest detail. I knew in advance that this coward would try to use me as a shield as soon as the smell of real legal trouble and a real prison sentence appeared. Kira skeptically arched an eyebrow and opened the digital signature log. The protected registry clearly displayed the unique secure key used to authorize that illegal fund transfer. I calmly explained that technical staff did not have and had never had access to the company's financial keys. With a smile, I reminded everyone that the security system had been designed personally by our genius Alina. My phrase hit the target directly. Alina flinched as if shocked, realizing that her recent boasting on camera was now working against her. She had tied herself to public statements about controlling the code. The system emotionlessly confirmed that the transfer had been authorized by Mark's personal executive key. The trap snapped shut with such mathematical precision that disproving the fact was technically impossible. The digital fingerprint of his device and the exact geolocation at the moment of the transaction became irrefutable proof. He had personally pressed the transfer button while sitting in that office, trying to save his precious servers. Mark leaned heavily on the edge of the glass table, his perfect hairstyle ridiculously disheveled. He was speechless, staring at the screen that was mercilessly destroying his reputation as a successful and honest entrepreneur. With a cold motion, the auditor removed her drive from the port. She officially announced that she was immediately blocking all remaining company accounts until the circumstances of that blatant financial incident were fully clarified. This meant a complete stop to all business processes of the platform. Without access to liquidity, they could not hire people, launch campaigns, or keep the system running even for the next couple of days. Kira added the final blow, saying she would organize an emergency meeting with the investors that evening. They would have to personally explain to the board of directors exactly where their starting millions of dollars had gone. Mark begged the auditor to give him just one day to solve the problem. He desperately promised to return all funds, swearing it was only a temporary misunderstanding caused by confusion in accounting documents. But Kira was unshakable. She answered harshly that the immutable registry did not tolerate misunderstandings or hidden temporary borrowings. The immutable registry had recorded theft, and she was obligated to act strictly by protocol. The elevator doors opened again, and the auditor decisively left the penthouse, leaving them alone with the approaching storm. The silence in the office became deafening again, but now it was the silence of liars doomed to catastrophe. In helpless rage, Mark slammed his fist onto the table, knocking an expensive water carafe from it. Glass shards scattered across the perfect parquet floor, symbolizing the broken illusions of his grand corporate omnipotence. Alina approached him and asked in a trembling voice how he could have done something so stupid. Her tone no longer contained blind admiration, only growing sticky fear of approaching legal responsibility. Mark snapped at her viciously, demanding she shut up and stop interfering while he feverishly thought. The illusion of their perfect partnership began rapidly decaying under the pressure of crisis, exposing their true rotten selfishness. He abruptly turned to me and ordered me to hack the auditor's database immediately to delete the compromising records. His desperation had reached the stage where fear of prison shuts down the instinct for self-preservation. I looked at him with the calm of a surgeon watching the agony of a hopeless patient. I dryly answered that I had no intention of committing a criminal offense to save a man who had trapped himself. Mark took a threatening step toward me, trying to switch into aggressive boss mode. He reminded me of the signed non-disclosure agreement, threatening to destroy my career with massive multi-million-dollar lawsuits. In response, I simply smiled and advised him to reread that very document carefully. I reminded him that the agreement had been signed with an invalid electronic signature, and I had kindly saved the full technical extract. His face stretched in shock. The last lever of pressure over me crumbled into dust before his eyes. He suddenly realized that from the first day, I had been playing by my own rules, 3 steps ahead. Alina looked at me in horror, for the first time truly realizing that I was no longer their obedient shadow. There was no fear in my eyes, no desire to serve, only cold calculation and absolute control of the situation. She timidly tried to remind me of our shared past, of how we had once dreamed of creating the project together. She wanted to play on my feelings, hoping the remnants of old affection would make me save her now. I answered harshly that our past had burned on the day my patent was stolen. She had traded her conscience for the fake status of chief executive officer, and now she would have to bear full responsibility for another person's financial schemes. The words sounded like a final sentence to her naive hopes. Alina sank heavily into the chair, covering her face with her hands. She finally understood that the glittering life of a successful executive was only a beautiful ticket to hell. Mark feverishly dialed his high-ranking patrons, but the callers seemed to have agreed not to answer. Rumors of a financial scandal spread through that cynical business world faster than a forest fire. I slowly gathered my technical case, preparing to leave that sinking ship. My work as an observer was complete. The tools of destruction had been launched, and now the gravity of their own lies would do everything. A closed notification from the investor's legal department arrived on my bracelet. The board of directors had officially initiated the contract termination procedure because of a gross violation of all financial obligations. Tomorrow morning, not just auditors, but an entire team of merciless corporate lawyers would come for them. They would come to seize all assets, the stolen intellectual property, and the remaining crumbs of liquidity. But the funniest part was that, through a clever chain of contracts, all those assets would pass under the control of my fund. They would bring me the keys to the company themselves, begging to preserve at least the illusion of freedom from prison. I confidently headed toward the glass doors, leaving them thrashing inside the luxurious trap. Tomorrow's emergency investor board meeting would be their public corporate execution, the one they had been walking toward from the first day, and I intended to watch the final collapse of their glass empire from the best seat. After all, I had written the very code that was now mercilessly erasing their names from corporate history. Part 5. The morning began with a deafening silence that hung like a heavy weight inside Mark's luxury penthouse. Yesterday's panic had been replaced by a suffocating, sticky wait for the inevitable corporate execution at the hands of the investors. At exactly 9 o'clock, the glass doors of the high-speed elevator silently slid apart. A team of 6 ruthless corporate lawyers confidently stepped into our pretentious technology office. They wore strict, dark suits and did not waste time on fake greetings. Their cold faces expressed nothing, and in their hands they firmly held tablets with activated seizure protocols. Mark tried to pull his signature arrogant smile onto his face and walked toward them with casual confidence. He still naively believed he could talk these sharks in circles the way he had done with gullible journalists. The senior lawyer did not even look at Mark's outstretched hand and dryly began reading the board of directors' decision in a monotone voice. The investment contract had officially been terminated unilaterally. Every word the lawyer spoke sounded like the merciless blow of a steel hammer against fragile glass. Mark slowly lowered his trembling hand, and his artificial confidence began crumbling before everyone's eyes. The collections specialist coldly announced that all remaining company assets were subject to immediate seizure. They had come to take everything: the software code, the expensive equipment, and even the office furniture. Alina stood aside, tightly clutching her shoulders as if trying to keep warm in an icy wind. Her trapped gaze nervously moved across the lawyers' stern faces, searching for even a drop of saving sympathy. But in this cynical world of big money, sympathy was not written into any investment contract. A mistake in financial calculations meant only one thing: the complete and unconditional destruction of the losing side. I sat calmly at my work terminal, pretending to run a standard morning diagnostic. In reality, I carefully watched every step of this brilliant legal execution. The asset seizure specialists routinely connected their diagnostic devices to the central routing node. They intended to transfer all management rights to the protected accounts of the investment board. Mark shouted hysterically that they had no right to shut down the servers without a prior court order. He threatened them with a loud countersuit, spitting as he waved his expensive phone, but the senior lawyer only adjusted his expensive glasses with disgust and pressed the final rights transfer confirmation button. The digital seizure process began, launching the harsh algorithm for alienating intellectual property. At that exact moment, a bright red system warning flashed on all the inspectors' tablets. The registry's protective contract rigidly blocked the attempt at outside interference in the core architecture. The senior lawyer frowned in displeasure, reading the fine print of the system log displayed on the screen. His perfect plan for a quick asset takeover had suddenly met an impenetrable digital wall. The system coldly informed them that the investors' board did not have priority debt recovery rights. All physical servers were already legally pledged to another financial organization. The previous night's operation by my secret fund worked flawlessly, like a Swiss mechanism. Since Mark had stolen money to pay the rent, the hardware rights automatically passed to the __quote_8__ fund. Ugly red blotches appeared on the senior lawyer's face from hidden anger and professional frustration. He loudly demanded an explanation of who had executed that enslaving contract right before the audit. Mark looked at me like a hunted animal, not understanding how his genius financial scheme had turned against him. After all, he himself had ordered me to make that transfer, hoping to save his position. Alina tried awkwardly to interfere, saying it must be some ridiculous technical error in the data registry. She was still clinging to the pathetic illusion of control over the situation, trying to turn on her charm. The lawyer sharply cut off her babbling and threw a printout of the immutable automatic contract onto the glass table. It showed Mark's digital signature recording the transfer of property to an unknown creditor. The board of directors had come to mercilessly tear the company apart and recover their spent millions, but they discovered in horror that someone far smarter had already stripped that digital corpse to the bone. My fund had officially become the first creditor in line, holding exclusive rights to all assets. The investors were left only with empty office chairs and colossal reputational losses in the technology market. I barely held back a slight smirk while watching predators from the corporate world realize their defeat. They thought they were cornering Mark, but in reality they themselves were firmly stuck in my clever net. The senior lawyer took a deep breath, trying to regain professional composure before his confused clients. He shifted his heavy gaze to Alina, deciding to strike at the only valuable resource remaining. If the servers now belonged to an outside fund, then the investors had to at least take the software architecture itself. They demanded immediate access to the full source code and encryption keys of the platform. The lawyer dryly ordered Alina, as the publicly declared chief developer of the project, to sit at the console and export the core. He wanted to see clean program code, free of backdoors and outside dependencies. The air in the meeting room seemed to thicken instantly, turning into a heavy, suffocating mass above Alina's head. Her face turned ash gray in a single second, and her hands began to tremble slightly, revealing animal panic. She walked toward the main terminal for what felt like an eternity, feeling 6 fixed, unblinking professional gazes on her back. Every step was like the movement of a condemned person walking to the place of final punishment. Mark nodded encouragingly to her, sincerely believing she would easily and naturally handle that simple export. After all, she had confidently spoken so many times at press conferences about her unique vision of the code. Alina collapsed into the leather chair and uncertainly placed her trembling fingers on the core control touch panel. The protection system requested a multi-level command to decrypt the root directories of our platform. She desperately tried to remember the lines of code I had shown her briefly several months earlier, but in her empty head there were now only the names of fashionable restaurants and brands of expensive office furniture. A red syntax error line appeared on the huge wall screen, rejecting her first clumsy login attempt. Alina frantically erased the symbols and tried entering another meaningless combination of numbers. The lawyers began exchanging displeased looks, noticing the unusual slowness of the company's technical genius. The senior inspector moved closer, studying the pathetic scraps of commands she was typing on the keyboard. The system loudly produced a second warning about an invalid request format, firmly blocking access to the protected folders. Alina quietly sobbed, realizing that her mask of a genius developer had just split in half. She looked at me with desperate pleading, expecting me to save her again, as I had done hundreds of times in the past. She wanted me to quietly take over control and execute the complex administrative command for her, but I simply sat in silence, arms crossed, watching her with a cold, emotionless gaze. My case was locked, and my fingers were as far as possible from any rescue keyboard. I allowed her to fully enjoy the fake status for which she had betrayed me so easily. If you loudly called yourself the chief architect, then carry that burden to the bitter end. The senior lawyer bent toward the screen with disgust and stated aloud that the director had a complete lack of basic technical knowledge. He loudly said that the so-called genius could not even write the simplest export script. Mark jumped up, trying to defend Alina with ridiculous excuses about extreme stress and outside pressure, but the inspectors had already understood everything, entering that shameful failure into their official electronic protocols. Alina's carefully built illusion of competence shattered into pieces, leaving behind only a frightened imposter. She covered her face with her hands, hiding from the contemptuous looks of people who had admired her yesterday. The lawyer noted with absolute coldness that a project built by incompetent people had no market value. The board of directors would officially abandon any attempt to save that sinking technological barge. They gave a dry farewell and headed toward the exit, leaving Mark and Alina in the ruins of their glass empire. The elevator doors closed, cutting off the last witnesses of their collapse. Mark collapsed heavily onto the leather sofa, staring at one point with the empty gaze of a man who had lost everything. His transit account was empty, his reputation destroyed, and the only valuable assets were in someone else's hands. Suddenly, he jumped up, seized by a new wave of panicked energy, and rushed to my work desk. In his inflamed mind, one last desperate plan had formed to save his pathetic corporate skin. He ordered me to search every available registry for detailed information about the secret __quote_9___ fund. He urgently needed to find the name of the real owner so he could try to negotiate directly, without lawyers. Mark's voice broke into shouting as he argued that this mysterious investor surely did not understand the real value of our startup. He believed he could charm him, offer a share, and climb back to the top of the food chain. I silently looked at that pathetic man, demanding to find the person calmly standing right in front of him. Pride prevented him from seeing the true puppeteer behind the mask of a quiet system administrator. Alina lifted her tear-filled eyes to me, silently begging me to do something to save the situation. She was ready to humiliate herself before anyone, as long as she did not have to return to her former gray and poor life. I slowly opened the search interface, carefully imitating intense work analyzing closed corporate information. My fingers tapped rhythmically on the keys, creating the illusion of a complex data extraction process. After 5 minutes, I displayed a fake but believable electronic business card on the large wall screen. It listed an encrypted communication channel with an official authorized representative of the Kuro Fund. Mark's eyes lit up with insane hope at the sight of the strict coordinates on the screen. He grabbed the tablet and began hurriedly dictating a voice message, humbly begging the unknown investor for an urgent personal meeting. He offered any terms, every imaginable guarantee, and the highest profit percentages in exchange for retaining control over the platform. His voice trembled disgustingly with flattery, and all his former arrogance disappeared without a trace. The message flew into the network, passing through a complex system of protected servers and encryption protocols. Mark froze in heavy expectation, nervously biting his lips and hypnotizing the blinking delivery status indicator. After 30 seconds, the hidden communicator in my pocket vibrated almost silently. 10 seconds later, a short, extremely dry reply from the mysterious owner of the __quote_11__ fund appeared on Mark's screen. The text stated that the fund representative agreed to one brief meeting tomorrow at exactly 12 o'clock noon. The location was the most expensive meeting room in their own emptying technology building. Mark threw his hands up victoriously, certain that his incredible business charisma had saved the situation at the last moment once again. He began feverishly dictating new saving points to Alina for tomorrow's presentation. Alina obediently nodded, frantically wiping away tears and trying to return something like professional confidence to her pale face. They were blindly clinging to lies again, refusing to accept the reality of their inevitable fall. I calmly closed my work terminal, watching the disgusting fuss of doomed people with cold interest. Tomorrow they would put on their best suits to bow before their savior. They did not understand that the agreement to this meeting was not a chance at salvation, but an official invitation to the scaffold. And the executioner on that scaffold would be the very man whose life they had so arrogantly destroyed. Part 6. The morning began with disgustingly fake bustle inside the most expensive meeting room of our glass office. Mark nervously paced along the panoramic windows, endlessly adjusting his tie. He rehearsed his greeting speech, carefully choosing the intonations of a successful and confident technology leader. His voice echoed from the empty walls, creating an illusion of importance. Alina sat at the long black marble table, frantically swiping through a glossy presentation on her tablet. She was trying to memorize complex terms whose meaning she did not understand. I quietly entered the room, carrying an ordinary technical case with cables and routers. My official task was to set up a secure communication channel for the important guest. Mark grimaced with disgust when he noticed my arrival and ordered me not to get in the way during the upcoming negotiations. He said the presence of minor service staff would ruin his image. I obediently nodded, agreeing with his assessment of my role in that grand corporate play. My hands quickly and habitually connected encrypted terminals to the room's main information panel. Every movement I made was accompanied by the quiet click of locks that permanently tied the infrastructure to my personal node. They thought I was preparing the stage for their triumphant rescue, but in reality, I was carefully setting up a digital guillotine, whose blade had already been raised above their heads. My hidden protocol was ready at any second to cut them off from the remains of their illusions. Mark stopped before the mirrored wall, admiring his flawless, expensive suit. He sincerely believed the right appearance could cover any financial holes in the company's balance sheet. They had forgotten the main rule of complex technological systems, the one I had tried to drill into them for years. No beautiful facade can hold a building if the root code is written with an error. Exactly 30 minutes remained before the scheduled meeting, and the air in the meeting room grew heavy fast. Mark's artificial confidence developed tiny cracks each time he looked at the clock. I took a place in the farthest corner of the room, blending with the gray acoustic panels on the walls. My tablet was safely hidden from their eyes, ready to activate the final phase of asset capture. The numbers on the huge digital board moved mercilessly toward noon, counting down the final minutes of their imaginary greatness. The silence in the spacious meeting room became truly deafening. Alina began nervously tapping an expensive stylus against the edge of the marble table. That rhythmic sound betrayed her animal fear, which she was desperately trying to hide behind the mask of a strict businesswoman. Again and again, she opened the financial report, where a huge hole from the stolen marketing money gaped in red numbers. Alina hoped the investor would not dig deeply into their documentation. Mark irritably asked her to stop making noise. His nerves were stretched to the absolute limit. He drank a glass of ice water in one gulp, trying to calm the treacherous trembling in his long fingers.
Pride always demands constant confirmation from the outside. When a false status begins to crumble, a narcissist does not seek a logical way out. He seeks a new victim to manipulate. Their egos are trapped in a deadly snare. Admitting a mistake terrifies them more than committing a crime. Fear of exposure makes them tighten the noose around their own necks with their own hands, blindly believing in their own exceptional nature.
Exactly 5 minutes remained before the fund representative arrived, and the tension reached its absolute peak. Mark came to my table and rudely ordered me to check the incoming communication channels again. He hissed through his teeth that if the broadcast failed, he would personally destroy my career in the industry forever. His threats sounded like the squeak of a cornered mouse trying to frighten a cat. I calmly displayed a green network indicator bar on the screen, confirming perfect connection quality. My voice was completely even when I reported that the guest was already in the system. Alina abruptly straightened in her chair, fixing her hair and pulling her most charming smile onto her face. She was ready to sell her soul to anyone who promised to preserve her imaginary position. Mark took the central seat at the table, placing his hands before him in the gesture of an open and confident negotiator. He stared directly into the black emptiness of the screen, waiting for his savior to appear. The digital board showed zeros, marking exactly 12 o'clock noon. The huge wall display blinked, switching into a protected video conference mode with the highest level of encryption. The loading bar moved slowly from left to right, making my former partners hold their breath. They were certain they were about to see a strict but foolish rich man they could easily deceive. The server gave a melodic signal, confirming successful authentication of the incoming user. At that moment, I slowly closed my technical case and stood up from my unnoticed place. My footsteps sounded unnaturally loud on the perfect parquet in that tense silence. Without looking, Mark waved his hand, ordering me to disappear from the frame immediately and not ruin the important meeting. But I did not go to the exit. Instead, I slowly walked to the huge marble table and stopped directly in front of the camera. I took my personal communicator from my pocket and pressed a single button. In the same second, the black screen on the wall flashed with blinding white light. Instead of the expected face of an anonymous investor, the logo of my hidden fund appeared, along with a successful authorization message. Under the logo, the name of the sole owner and chief executive officer of the corporation appeared. It was my full name, written in large bold letters, against the background of a digital signature from the immutable registry. For several seconds, Mark stupidly stared at the huge letters, unable to connect reality with the image. His mind refused to process information that destroyed his new world. He laughed nervously, turning to me with a face twisted by rage. Mark shouted that it was a stupid technical error and demanded that I immediately remove my worthless name from the main screen. Alina made no sound. She stared at the glowing display with eyes widened in horror, her breathing becoming uneven. The meaning of that terrifying coincidence began slowly reaching her. I walked around the table and smoothly lowered myself into the luxurious leather chair meant for the main guest. My tablet synchronized with the room system, giving me full control over the equipment. The light in the meeting room dimmed slightly, focusing all attention on the glowing corporate emblem of my fund. I looked straight into Mark's panicked eyes and calmly greeted him. I said that the chief executive officer of the investment group had arrived at the meeting exactly at the scheduled time. My voice carried no emotion, as if I were reading a dry protocol of long machine code. Mark slammed his fist onto the marble table, demanding that I stop this ridiculous circus. He was certain I had simply hacked the control panel to take revenge for my legal dismissal from the project. He reached for the security call panel, intending to order security to throw me into the street. His fingers furiously pressed the touch buttons, but the system answered only with brief refusals. A red marker on the screen highlighted the cryptographic signature, leaving no doubt about the authenticity of the document. I officially owned every byte of information in that luxurious building. Alina tried to say something, but only a pitiful, squeezed rasp came from her throat. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white from excessive physical tension. I enjoyed their shock without saying a single unnecessary word. This entire long game, all their mockery and humiliation, had brought them to the exact point where I became their only absolute creditor. The silence in the room became so thick it could have been cut with a surgical scalpel. The illusion of their greatness shattered into fragments, scattering across the floor in glittering, sharp pieces of truth. Mark tried to call security on his phone, but his fingers would not obey. The device slipped out of his damp hands and fell onto the polished marble with a dull thud. He slowly lifted his eyes to me, and there was no trace of his former superiority in them anymore. There was only the primitive terror of a man who had realized he had driven himself into a concrete trap. Alina finally unfroze and began saying some ridiculous nonsense about our old relationship in a trembling voice. She tried to call me by my name, pouring as much fake warmth as possible into the word. She said she had always known about my hidden potential and that all of this had simply been a harsh leadership test. Alina begged me to stop frightening them and begin a normal, constructive dialogue. Her pitiful attempt to play on past feelings gave me only cold disgust. I opened a new tab on the screen and displayed an audio waveform of her testimony before the investors yesterday. Her own confident voice rang loudly from the hidden speakers. The recording clearly broadcast how she swore she had personally controlled every stage of the platform's creation and all expenses. The recording stopped as abruptly as it had begun. I politely asked Alina whether she was ready to confirm her words under oath when a team of financial investigators entered the office. She shrank into herself, hiding her face in trembling palms. Her status as the genius creator of the platform had turned into reinforced concrete proof of her involvement in large-scale financial manipulation. Mark tried to gather the remnants of his dignity. In a hoarse voice, he said, I would not dare destroy the company, because then my own investments would become useless digital trash. He thought he had found a weak point in my perfect logic. Mark tried to smile, deciding I was only bluffing to secure better terms for myself on the project's board of directors. But he did not understand the scale of my plan. I entered a short command into the terminal, and the main display opened the liquidity distribution structure of my hidden financial module. The charts clearly showed how the algorithm had been extracting tiny fractions of value from their transactions for months. The company was not merely unprofitable, it had been irreversibly dried out from within. I calmly explained to Mark that there was no point in destroying the company because it was already dead. I had not come here to save their business, but to take away their freedom. The numbers on the screen blinked red, reflecting in the widened pupils of my former partners. Each red line was another nail in the coffin of their brilliant corporate careers. I displayed the final document, the one for which this entire complex chess game had been arranged. It was a detailed report on the misuse of the investor's transit account the previous night. The logs clearly recorded how Mark's personal digital key had transferred a huge sum of money to pay for server rental. It was a direct, irrefutable fact of a grand corporate crime. Mark gasped for air, unbuttoning the collar of his expensive silk shirt. The air in the meeting room seemed scorching to him. Even though the powerful air conditioners continued silently pumping Arctic cold, I slid two thin tablets with open electronic documents across the smooth marble. They stopped exactly in front of Mark and Alina, waiting for their immediate and unconditional decision. They were full confessions to stealing intellectual property and misusing designated funds. The texts described each of their schemes in detail, starting from the very first day of deception. I gave them a simple but merciless condition. Either they signed those documents right now, transferring full rights to me and surrendering to the law, or I pressed the button to send the logs. If I sent those logs directly to the investors and the police, they would face the maximum prison sentence without the right to a deal. My ultimatum left them no room for clever maneuvers. Alina began sobbing loudly, smearing expensive makeup across her pale face. She begged Mark to think of something, use his famous connections, call his patrons from high society, but Mark sat motionless, staring blankly into the shiny surface of the table. All his connections had been built only on money he no longer had, and on a status that had vanished. He stretched a trembling hand toward the tablet, trying at least to read the terms of his unconditional surrender. The letters swam before his eyes, merging into one solid black stripe of absolute collapse. At that moment, the glass doors of the meeting room smoothly slid apart. Technical Auditor Kira stood on the threshold, and behind her stood two grim officers from the financial police. Kira looked at the crushed Mark with a slight smirk, then shifted a respectful gaze to me. In her hands was a thick folder containing a warrant for the immediate freezing of all company accounts. Mark made a strange gurgling sound, realizing that the time to think had finally run out. The trap had snapped shut with such force that it broke not only their careers, but their pathetic lying lives as well. I silently watched as the officers entered the room, preparing to read the rights of the former owners of that glass empire. My code had worked flawlessly, completing the perfect cycle of total destruction. Part 7. The financial police worked with frightening method, locking every terminal in the luxurious meeting room. The cold light of the screens reflected in their stern faces, leaving Mark no chance of salvation. Officers from the cyber division connected their protected keys to the system core, permanently closing access for the former owners. The sound of clicking keyboards echoed through the glass hall, measuring the seconds until collapse. Mark tried to steady his breathing and assume the pose of the confident owner of a multi-million-dollar technology corporation. He loudly told the senior inspector that he was the only lawful founder of the business. His voice trembled unpleasantly, exposing panic, but he stubbornly clung to the illusion of his leadership position. He demanded that his lawyers be called immediately and that this outrageous abuse of power be stopped. The inspector did not even turn his head toward him, continuing to enter lock commands on his service tablet. The silence in the glass office became thicker, more suffocating, and unbearably heavy to breathe. I slowly rose from the table, drawing the attention of Mark as he thrashed in hysteria. In my hands was a thin sheet of official digital notification, printed only minutes before the start of the large-scale raid. In a calm tone, I informed him that his founder status had been annulled late yesterday evening. The automatic debt contract for server rental contained one interesting clause about fast debt conversion. As soon as Mark technically defaulted on payment, the automated system instantly transferred 99% of the shares to the Kuro Fund. Now he was not the owner of the company, but an ordinary employee. Mark's face turned ash gray when he finally understood the true scale of his crushing financial catastrophe. He had committed an official crime for a company that no longer belonged to him. Every penny he had stolen, every illegal transfer of investment funds, now fell heavily on him personally. He had destroyed his reputation to save my legal corporate property. Alina huddled in the corner on an expensive leather sofa, clutching her disabled work communicator in trembling hands. Her new world was collapsing before her eyes, burying all her ambitious dreams under the rubble forever. Realizing that Mark had been completely destroyed and would never again be able to provide her luxurious life, she decided to act. Primitive survival instinct made her rush to the inspector with pathetic babbling. She hurriedly said that she had been only a naive pawn in someone else's game, someone who did not understand complex technical details. She loudly accused Mark of forcing her to sign all the fraudulent papers. Mark stared at her in complete incomprehension, as if seeing for the first time the true icy face of the woman he had considered a loyal ally. The betrayal on which they had built their alliance now turned against him. The officer dryly asked Alina to provide digital proof of her non-involvement in developing the malicious architecture. He reminded her of the severe criminal liability for giving false testimony during an investigation. Alina looked at me with desperate hope, expecting me to confirm her words and somehow save her from prison. She still naively believed she could manipulate my emotions by using our shared past, but instead of a warm look of sympathy, she received only my cold and calculated answer. I displayed a high-quality recording of her television interview on the central screen, where she proudly claimed control over the code. Her own clear voice from the speakers sounded like a final guilty verdict, destroying any attempt to become a victim. In addition, I opened the protected registry with her immutable personal signatures. Every fraudulent algorithm module, every hidden script deceiving investors, had been officially certified with her unique identifier. She had wanted public fame so badly that she documented her own crimes. Alina covered her face with her hands and sobbed, realizing that her fake status had become her main prison. No lawyer could challenge evidence in the immutable registry. The senior inspector nodded with satisfaction, attaching digital copies of the immutable registry and the video recording of her public admission to the criminal case. Now both founders held the status of main defendants in the case. The seizure of physical server property began 15 minutes after the full freeze of all virtual transit accounts. Grim technicians in logistics service uniforms entered the luxurious penthouse. They began methodically disconnecting the humming server racks and carefully packing expensive monitors into strong transport crates. The sound of tape being pulled off echoed loudly through the emptying technology hall. The manager of the elite office building appeared at the entrance, looking with disgust at the bewildered Mark and the former director crying in the corner. He carried an official legal notice terminating the lease agreement. Mark tried to protest, shamelessly saying the rent had been paid a month in advance from those very designated investment funds. He still could not shake the ingrained habit of arrogantly dictating his terms. The manager dryly answered that the corporate accounts had been frozen, and the payment was recognized as invalid because the money came from criminal origins. He firmly demanded that they surrender the electronic access rings to the penthouse immediately. Mark slowly pulled the smart ring from his finger, the same ring he had considered a symbol of his limitless power that very morning. His groomed hands trembled as he threw the plastic identifier onto the glass tabletop. Alina obediently followed his example, removing her ring and placing it beside his with incredible caution, as if it were red-hot metal. The symbols of their high status had turned into useless pieces of plastic. The building guards politely but firmly pointed them toward the freight service elevator used by cleaners. They were no longer allowed to use the main glass doors meant for directors. I watched as they descended the dirty steps of the back stairwell, escorted by security. Their expensive suits now looked like a ridiculous mockery of their true position in that merciless society. They stepped out into pouring rain without umbrellas because even the umbrellas with the company logo had been officially seized as corporate property. Their shining career ended in a puddle behind the business center. I approached the huge panoramic window, looking at the endless metropolis spread below, under gray autumn clouds. My glass castle had finally been cleansed of the thieves who had tried to seize it illegally. Technical auditor Kira quietly approached me, confidently holding her work drive with the decrypted system logs. She had spent the last hours deeply analyzing my hidden architecture. She spoke in a quiet voice, expressing sincere professional admiration for the incredible level of control I had built. She understood that I had not merely destroyed their business, but had also legally taken the assets for myself. Kira pointed with a thin stylus at a line of code controlling complex routing of user data during testing. She guessed that the entire client database had been secretly copied to protected nodes. I gave a short nod, confirming her brilliant analytical guess. The contract they forced me to sign during my dismissal contained a loophole that left me full copyrights to that collection algorithm. We stood in the emptying office, silently watching the last elements of someone else's illusion being packed into boxes and carried out the door. Kira was the only person who could appreciate the true beauty of my game. Kira looked at me carefully, as if reassessing the scale of my strategic thinking. She admitted that at first, she had considered me a talented engineer who had ended up as the naive victim of deception. Now she clearly saw before her a cold-blooded architect capable of using enemies' greed as the perfect weapon. My method of defense had proven far deadlier than any open aggression in court, but that grand chess game had not yet been played to the very end. I knew Mark's rotten nature too well to believe in his complete and unconditional surrender after the first serious loss of assets. A system security monitoring indicator on my tablet quietly beeped, tuned to backup data storage. A red notification appeared on the screen about an unauthorized access attempt to the cloud. Mark, somewhere on the wet street, was using his old emergency access to connect to a shadow server. He planned to download a backup copy of the user database for urgent sale to competitors on the market. It was his final desperate attempt to earn at least some dirty money for expensive lawyers and an immediate escape from the country. He sincerely believed that secret drive had gone unnoticed during the inspection. Kira looked at the blinking download indicator with visible concern, assuming we had to block the communication channel immediately. A leak of investor data could be a major blow to our platform's reputation. I calmly closed the emergency blocking panel, allowing the green download bar to slowly move toward the 100% completion mark. I explained to Kira that this was not a dangerous leak but a carefully placed trap. The database the defeated Mark was so greedily pulling down was fake. I had deliberately created that shadow archive a month earlier, filling it with synthetic profiles and hidden marker beacons. Each generated profile had aggressive viral code securely stitched into it, set to activate only during an attempted resale. Mark was not merely stealing garbage, he was stealing a digital time bomb. As soon as he tried to transfer that file to any potential buyer among our competitors, the hidden protection would trigger. It would instantly send a report to the cybercrime division. And this time, the official accusation would not simply concern embezzlement, but global industrial espionage of the highest level. Mark was weaving the final loop into the strong rope that would hang him. Kira smiled, shaking her head in absolute agreement with my logic. She finally understood that engaging me in a technological war had been the most fatal and destructive mistake of Mark's life. Cold rain began outside, washing away the remaining false shine from that long workday. I received a notification from the police that Mark and Alina had been temporarily released on bail until the first court hearing. They had only a few days of illusory freedom, during which they would make one fatal mistake after another. Their inflated egos simply would not allow them to humbly accept their deserved defeat. I opened the main administrator console of the Kuro Fund and launched the official rebranding process for all captured server infrastructure. My product was finally returning to its creator, shedding someone else's dirty labels. The updated platform logo appeared on the huge screen of the meeting room, forever free from the influence of lying investors. Now, every action in the system generated legal profit only for my fund. Tonight, Mark would surely try to meet representatives of Apex Corporation, our unscrupulous competitors. He would offer to sell them the database, counting on their blind corporate greed, and they would certainly agree to that deal, because in business no one refuses cheap profiles. They would naively open Mark's encrypted file on their servers, launching a deadly chain reaction. My database would immediately implant spy trackers into the competitor's architecture, methodically collecting evidence of their illegal activity. I planned to destroy not only the traitors but all enemies with a single blow. I poured myself a glass of ice water, enjoying the perfect silence of my legal office cleansed of parasites. Tomorrow was supposed to be the beginning of a grand corporate war of annihilation. At that moment, my protected communicator gave a short signal. An encrypted text message from an unknown international number appeared on the screen, using complex location-hiding algorithms. The message contained only one short sentence offering to buy my base algorithm immediately for a huge amount of money. There was no sender name, but the figures spoke for themselves. Someone in the shadows had been watching Mark's fall very closely and had decided to make an aggressive move while the dust from the destruction had not yet settled. It was a direct challenge from a new and dangerous financial player. I slowly placed the communicator on the table, realizing that destroying my former partners had only been a warm-up before the real battle. The stakes in this game had just soared to the heavens, and there was no way back. Part 8. Morning light barely forced its way through the dense tinted glass of the main meeting room of Apex Corporation, creating an atmosphere of dark secrecy and heavy expectation inside. Mark sat nervously across from their board of directors, gripping in sweaty hands his thin tablet with the shadow database of my original project that he had stolen the night before. He had been released on bail only a few hours earlier, but instead of preparing for the inevitable trial, he had decided to play his last, dirtiest, and most desperate corporate game. He sincerely believed that this stolen information would become his golden ticket to freedom, guaranteeing protection and patronage from our main competitors. The head of Apex looked with open contempt at the cornered former chief executive officer, perfectly understanding the full extent of his current legal vulnerability. They offered him mere pennies compared to the real value of the algorithms, but Mark had no other choice except to humbly accept their harsh conditions. Mark hurriedly entered the password and handed them the drive, not suspecting that he was voluntarily giving them a digital time bomb I had carefully prepared in advance. Apex technical specialists immediately connected the drive to their internal architecture, greedily copying thousands of lines of perfect code into their own closed repositories. I watched the process from the screen of my updated terminal in the office of the Kuro Fund, seeing my hidden spy trackers happily spread through someone else's infrastructure. Every folder they copied automatically activated a deep implantation protocol, forever linking the servers of those brazen competitors with my personal monitoring control panel. Now Apex had officially and irreversibly recorded the fact of industrial espionage by storing immutable digital marks from my copyright registry on its hard drives. Mark exhaled victoriously after receiving the long-awaited notification that the first part of his modest fee had been deposited into his new anonymous account. Thoughtfully opened in an unreachable offshore zone, he was sure he had just outplayed me by selling the most valuable core of the system and securing a comfortable life far away from the annoying financial police. But he did not account for the fact that the money was only bait, and his new offshore account had long been under the full observation of my auditor, Kira. The competitors happily shook his hand, ushering him out the door while their own servers slowly began choking on the enormous number of implanted shadow requests. Leaving Mark to enjoy his illusory victory, I turned my attention to the encrypted communication channel through which the anonymous purchase offer had arrived during the night. The unknown player's offer of $50 million was too large for an ordinary venture capitalist and too small for an international technology monopoly. I launched a complex reverse tracing algorithm, directing the computing power of the Kuro Fund toward breaking the multi-layer protection of that arrogant and overconfident subscriber. One Apex defensive line almost returned my request back to the Kuro Fund. I stopped the trace for a second, otherwise Rain would have received my name before the meeting. My code methodically broke through one proxy server after another, untangling a long chain of fake companies registered under frontmen in different corners of the world. After 20 tense minutes, the system produced the final result, displaying on my monitor a hidden digital trail leading to the main board of directors of Apex. The situation became clear instantly. The main investor of Apex was playing a double game, trying to legally buy my rights while his own subordinates were buying stolen code from Mark. The shadow player wanted insurance in case of unexpected legal problems, hoping to obtain a clean patent while also inserting my code into his architecture for free. It was greed of the highest order, the same greed that inevitably makes people commit fatal mistakes, forgetting the basic rules of digital security. I quickly typed a short reply, politely thanking the anonymous buyer for the generous offer, but stating that my algorithm was not for sale at any price. At the end of the message, I attached a tiny executable file, disguised as a standard refusal memorandum, designed to collect data from the investor's personal device. The message instantly flew to its recipient, and I leaned back in my expensive chair, watching the delivery status indicator blink a pleasant green on my large screen. Now the entire upper tier of the rival corporation was under my close control, voluntarily swallowing the bait because of their uncontrolled corporate pride and greed. My bracelet vibrated, accepting an incoming call from Kira. Her voice sounded dry and entirely professional, but clear notes of cruel anticipation could be heard in it. She reported that Alina had just contacted her through a protected line, begging for an urgent personal meeting to hand over important evidence against Mark in exchange for immunity. The rats had begun actively devouring each other on the sinking ship, trying to bargain for salvation by completely destroying their former criminal partners. The meeting was scheduled in the spacious lobby of a glass financial center, where Kira usually held harsh interviews with ambitious bank managers who had made mistakes. Alina looked terrible. Nothing remained of her former polished confidence and perfect posture as a successful executive, replaced by panicked animal fear of prison. I watched their conversation through the hidden camera in Kira's brooch, receiving perfect video and clean audio directly on my work monitor in the safe meeting room of my fund. With trembling hands, Alina handed the auditor an external drive, swearing that it contained Mark's personal correspondence, proving his sole guilt in the misuse of all funds. She cried and convincingly described how Mark had psychologically pressured her, forcing her to sign false reports and publicly claim the glory of chief architect. Kira listened to that pathetic confession without emotion, not even touching the offered drive. Her cold gaze seemed to scan Alina through and through, finding not a single drop of truth. The technical auditor slowly took out her own work tablet and turned the screen toward Alina, showing a long list of confirmed recorded transactions. They were the very transfers Alina had personally authorized with her executive key while trying to hide financial holes before the first stress test of our platform. Kira explained in an even voice that a digital signature in the registry was not subject to psychological pressure, and the court would consider only dry cryptographic facts, not tears. Alina's face twisted with genuine horror. She tried to grab the tablet as if hoping to physically erase the records, but Kira firmly caught her wrist directly above the table. The auditor coldly added that an attempt to shift blame onto a partner without providing real access keys would be classified by investigators as concealment and obstruction of justice. The realization of total collapse struck Alina with monstrous force. She understood that her fake status had not only failed to protect her, but had become the main unbreakable evidence in the case. Kira calmly rose from the table, leaving Alina sobbing over a cold cup of coffee. The auditor had completed her task flawlessly, depriving the traitor of her last illusory hope. I saved the recording of the meeting into a protected folder. Now we had official video in which the former chief executive officer voluntarily admitted involvement in fraud. There was no way back for her anymore. She had dug that hole herself when she decided to trade her engineering talent for cheap popularity and other people's dirty investor money. Meanwhile, very intriguing events began taking place at the central office of Apex. My trackers successfully completed integration and entered the active phase of their task. On the huge plasma screens of their dispatch center, red warning symbols suddenly began blinking, signaling a large-scale loss of critical data packets. Mark was still inside the building, arrogantly drinking vintage cognac in the lounge area for privileged guests while waiting for the second tranche from his brilliant deal of the century. Suddenly, the doors of the luxury lounge burst open with a crash, and Apex corporate security stormed in, roughly knocking the glass from the stunned Mark's hands. Behind the guards appeared the corporation's enraged technical director. He threw a tablet onto the table in front of Mark, demanding an immediate explanation for the madness happening in the network. The stolen database Mark had sold them as a panacea turned out to be an aggressive ransomware virus. My code methodically blocked their own proprietary developments. The Apex system was literally devouring itself from the inside, sending decryption keys to the servers of my fund and turning the competitors into my powerless digital hostages.
The illusion of impunity is sweet poison for an inflated ego. Mark sincerely believed he could easily sell a stolen weapon without checking the fingerprints on its trigger. Pride blinded him so completely that he personally carried a bomb into the lair of his saviors. That is the ultimate fate of every narcissist. He always becomes the chief architect of his own downfall, believing himself a genius until the very end.
Staring at the rapidly running lines of system errors, he tried to justify himself ridiculously, claiming it was only a temporary compatibility bug between different architectural solutions. But the technical director grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive jacket, threatening to hand him to the police immediately for attempting deliberate sabotage of a major international company's servers. Mark realized he had been caught in deadly pincers between the financial police, pursuing him for embezzlement, and a powerful corporation, accusing him of monstrous sabotage. With trembling hands, he tried to enter a cancellation code, but my interface returned only a short access denial message with a mocking note about gross copyright infringement. His pathetic attempts to stop the process only accelerated the encryption. Apex screens went dark one after another, then the shining logo of my Kuro fund slowly and elegantly surfaced on them. The main competitor in the market was paralyzed. Their stock would begin falling sharply as soon as morning trading opened, and there was no way to stop the process now. The guards roughly threw Mark back into a chair and assigned 2 men to watch him so he would not try to escape before the official representatives of the authorities and corporate lawyers arrived. I calmly closed my terminal and headed toward the exit of the penthouse. It was time to pay an official visit to the paralyzed Apex office and take what rightfully belonged to me. Near the huge glass doors of their central building, Kira was already waiting for me, accompanied by an entire group of stern government inspectors from the cybercrime division. We passed freely through the locked turnstiles because my system kindly opened every door for us, ignoring the desperate commands of the local security service. The main meeting room was filled with tomb-like silence. Mark sat in the corner with a face gray from terror, while Apex leadership frantically tried to reach their shadow lead investor. I threw a heavy folder of printed registry logs onto the table, officially confirming that Apex Corporation had knowingly purchased stolen intellectual property. The head of Apex tried to object, claiming they had been victims of Mark's sophisticated fraud and had not suspected the origin of those dirty digital archives. But Kira immediately displayed on the wall projector an audio recording of their negotiations with Mark, in which they openly discussed integrating the stolen algorithm to destroy my project. The law was on our side. Under international cybersecurity rules, using stolen code gave me the full right to place a lawful hold on all their server capacity. Mark looked at me with the empty gaze of a completely broken man. His genius rescue plan had turned into a concrete slab that had just crushed the remnants of his life. The inspectors began methodically seizing the competitors' hard drives, preparing strict official confiscation protocols. The Apex empire was collapsing before everyone's eyes because of its own unrestrained greed. At that very moment, a second message from the same shadow investor arrived on my communicator. This time, he was not offering money. He demanded an immediate personal meeting with me. My viral memorandum had successfully opened his defense. Now I knew exactly the name of the man pulling the strings inside Apex and trying to buy my technology cheaply through front men. It was one of the most influential people on the Venture Capital Council, the very man who had originally initiated the audit of our company, hoping to destroy it from within. I looked at the crushed Mark, who no longer interested me at all. He was only a pathetic and blind pawn in a game that was only now approaching its finale. Tomorrow would be the final act of this drama. I replied to the shadow player with a brief agreement to meet, scheduling it in the center of our locked building. Now cleared of traitors, all the threads had finally converged into a single point. The trap had closed over the last and largest predator, and I was ready to show him the true power of flawless code. Part 9 by morning, the building no longer looked like a startup office. Inspectors stood at the entrance, the server floors were sealed, and the lobby smelled of ozone, dust, and other people's fear. I arrived earlier than the scheduled time and sat in the meeting room where, only yesterday, Mark had been selling my code as his own revolution. Now that room belonged to Fax. Kira stood by the wall with a tablet, silently checking the witness list. She asked no unnecessary questions because she already understood. The final meeting would not be a conversation, but an autopsy. Through the glass doors entered Victor Rain, the man who had controlled the venture council from the shadows for years. His smile was calm, but the guards behind him revealed his true fear. He sat across from me without an invitation and placed a thin folder on the table. Inside was an offer to buy the Kuro Fund for a sum large enough to purchase half the market. Rain said wars between intelligent people should not reach public court. According to him, I could keep my money, my name, and my freedom if I handed him the keys to the core. I did not open the folder. Paper had no meaning when a man brought it too late. He had not come to buy the technology, but to stop the evidence chain that had already reached his name. Rain smiled almost imperceptibly and called me talented but inexperienced. He reminded me that the Kuro Fund rested on gray roots, shadow deals, and controversial debt recovery algorithms. He wanted to show that he could turn my victory into my own accusation. That threat would have worked on someone who improvised, but I had been preparing this conversation since the first presentation. I turned on the wall screen and displayed the first document. It was an old venture council protocol in which Rain had personally approved the audit of my company 1 month before its artificial bankruptcy. His gaze became heavier, but his smile did not disappear. He said committees approved dozens of inspections every day, and there was nothing illegal about that. I nodded because I had been waiting for exactly that answer. The next file was a recording of a closed call between Rain and Mark. In it, Rain demanded that debt pressure be accelerated before I had time to register patent protection for the core. The room became quieter. Kira stopped moving. One of Rain's lawyers reached for his tablet, but the inspector at the door curtly ordered him to keep his hands off the table. For the first time, Rain looked not at me but at the screen. His face remained calm, but his fingers squeezed the edge of the folder so tightly that the expensive leather cracked under his nails. He said the recording could have been forged. Then I opened the chain of verification markers, where every audio fragment was tied to a time, Mark's device, and the backup server of Rain's own company. I did not raise my voice. The drier the facts sounded, the less space remained for theater. Rain wanted to argue with emotions, but received immutable mathematics. A third layer of evidence appeared on the screen. Mark had not merely stolen the code, he had acted as the executor of a scheme in which Rain gained control over my technology through artificial debt. Alina sat aside, pale and almost motionless. She had been brought in as a witness. But she already understood that her beautiful title had been only a screen for someone else's hunt. Mark appeared last, between two inspectors. He looked not like the founder of an empire, but like a man who had spent the whole night trying to negotiate with people who no longer answered his calls. When he saw Rain, he jerked forward. Weak hope flashed in his eyes, as if the true master of the game could still pull him from the pit they had dug together for me. Rain did not even turn his head. At that moment, Mark understood that he had become expendable material. His fear finally turned into hatred for the man for whom he had destroyed his life. I opened the final package of files and displayed the ownership chain on the screen. The debts of my old company, the server leasing, the patents, Mark's assets, and the frozen Apex capacity all converged on the Kuro Fund. This was not magic and not secret status. It was a sequence of signatures, keys, deadlines, defaults, and public orders my enemies had left behind when they considered me furniture. Rain listened silently while his connections to Apex appeared on the screen. Through shell companies, he had paid for the purchase of the stolen database and then tried to present himself as the savior of the market. Kira displayed beside it the conclusion of the Independent Technical Council. The core code was recognized as my original product, and all derivative systems from Mark and Apex depended on an illegal copy. Rain leaned back in his chair and quietly said that the market does not like heroes with grudges. He suggested that I think about the consequences if I turned a private war into a public scandal. I answered that the scandal had already begun. While he was driving here, the document package had been sent through 3 independent channels, to the regulator, the Investors' Council, and the International Digital Asset Commission. His lawyer rose sharply, but the meeting room door opened first. Commission representatives entered, and the senior inspector immediately asked Victor Rain to remain for official questioning. That was the exact moment Mark broke. He shouted that he had done everything under Rain's instructions, that Alina knew about the forged documents, and that the investors themselves had demanded my name be erased from the project faster. It was not courage but an animal attempt to survive. But for the protocol, motive did not matter. His confession landed on top of the audio, logs, and financial transfers like the final missing bolt. Alina covered her face with her palms, but her fingers trembled so strongly that it could no longer be called a pose. Her beautiful title fell apart, and underneath it remained only ordinary fear. She quietly said that Mark had promised her protection and a share in the new holding. Then she looked at me and tried to say my name, as if it could still open a door into the past. I did not interrupt her, but I did not help either. Once, her voice could have made me doubt myself. Now between us lay interviews, signatures, and letters in which she had voluntarily claimed my work. She asked me not to destroy her completely, and for the first time there was no director's role in her voice. I answered that I was only returning to everyone what they had signed, said, and done. That phrase struck her harder than shouting. Alina lowered her eyes and finally understood. The punishment had not come from my anger, but from the documents she herself had created. Rain tried to stand, but the inspector placed an order for temporary asset arrest in front of him. It listed my name as the owner of the original technology and the lawful creditor of the key systems. Victor Rain looked at me without smiling. He finally saw not a former engineer, not a wounded founder, not a shadow beside a server rack, but the person who had forced their entire mechanism to work against them. I signed the transfer of the cleaned core to a new company, not the one that had carried Mark's name, and not the one Rain had wanted to buy for silence. It was a structure where patents, servers, and licenses returned under my control. Kira became the temporary independent observer. The Investors' Council received access to the clean version of the system, but under new terms, where my fund controlled every license and every entry point. Mark heard this and laughed with a hollow, broken sound. He understood he had lost not only the stolen company, he had lost even the ability to tell himself that he had been the real creator. The inspectors let him out first. He did not resist. He only looked at the floor as if trying to find there the very line of code he had never understood and had still called his own. Alina paused at the door. She said that once she truly had believed in our project, but her voice broke on the last word and, for the first time, sounded without protection. I answered that belief is not enough if, at the decisive moment, you choose someone else's lie instead of your own conscience. She nodded so slowly, it was as if she had finally heard not me, but herself. She left silently. There was no longer the shine of a director or the confidence of a winner in her step, only the emptiness of a person who had risen in a stolen elevator and discovered that the cable had long been cut. Only Kira and I remained in the meeting room. On the screen, the new rights registry glowed where my name stood, for the first time in a long while, not in an archival footnote, but at the center of the system. Kira asked whether I intended to keep the name Kuro. I looked at the fund logo and for the first time in all those months felt not cold anger, but heavy relief. Kuro had not been revenge, but a protective circuit. I had created it in the dark while they were erasing me from documents, and now it had fulfilled its task. But the new company did not have to live only on old pain. I opened the registration panel and changed the public name of the project. Mark's old name disappeared, and in its place appeared the original core tag I had invented, back in the laboratory before the betrayal. On the server floors, green indicators gradually lit up. The system was starting now without false owners, hidden leaks, and someone else's signatures that had suffocated its development for years. I walked to the panoramic window. Below, the city moved like a huge transaction diagram. People hurried, cars changed lanes, windows flashed with signals of other people's small decisions. Once, I had thought victory would feel like rage, that at the end I would want to see Mark on his knees, Alina in tears, Rain in handcuffs, and the whole room admitting I had been right. But real victory turned out to be quieter. It was in the fact that I no longer needed to prove my worth to people who had seen me only as a convenient shadow. My bracelet vibrated with the final notification. All assets had been transferred, all licenses confirmed, all illegal access closed, and the Kuro Fund had become the main holder of the restored platform. I turned off hidden monitoring mode. For the first time in a long time, I no longer needed to hide in a corner, wait for someone else's mistake, and build a trap out of every insult. Before leaving, I stopped near the same central stand where Mark had once shown investors the stolen presentation. Now the screen did not display someone else's victory. It showed a simple line about the launch of the clean version of the system. No loud titles, no stolen speeches, no Alina beside a fake genius, and no Mark standing in my light. I pressed the confirmation button. The platform switched into open mode, and the first real clients connected to the core that finally worked under the name of its creator. Outside, dawn was already breaking. The glass walls no longer seemed like a cold cage, because now I looked at the city not from someone else's shadow, but from my own restored space. They had wanted to leave me as technical furniture by the wall. They had wanted to buy my voice, erase my patents, and turn my code into the foundation of their empire. But complex systems always remember the real author. They record every access, every signature, every lie, and every attempt to steal what you do not know how to create. I left the meeting room empty-handed. I no longer needed hidden recordings, backup keys, or other people's mistakes to feel control over my own life. The game ended not because I destroyed them louder than anyone else. It ended because truth received infrastructure, while the lie was left without a server, without a signature, and without the right to restart.